Well, the appointed hour, appointed time has come, so we'll get started. Welcome. It's good to be together on the first day of Native American Heritage Month, no? To talk about a topic like this. So I'm going to begin by showing a short video by the National Congress of American Indians, which is one of the key organizations that has opposed Native American mascots, symbols, and rituals. So let me...
Proud, forgotten, Indian, Navajo, Blackfoot, Inuit, and Sioux, survivor, spiritualist, patriot, Sitting Bull, Hiawatha, and Jim Thorpe. Mother, father, son, daughter, chief. Apache, Pueblo, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Crow. Underserved, struggling, resilient. Squanto, Red Cloud, Tecumseh, and Crazy Horse. Rancher, teacher, doctor, soldier. Seminole, Seneca, Mohawk, and Creek. Mills, Will Rogers, Geronimo. Unyielding, strong, indomitable. Native Americans call themselves many things. The one thing they don't.
So I should warn you as we continue that I will on occasion use the word that's left unsaid at the end of this video. It's an ugly word, but it's difficult to discuss the controversy without making reference to it, I think. So I'd like to continue with a brief personal story. When I was a young boy, my family didn't have a lot of money. I came from a family of factory workers and mechanics and truck drivers. And especially we didn't have money for things that weren't necessities. But I can still remember on one occasion, my mom and dad bought me a maroon and gold pom-pom knit hat that was emblazoned with the logo of the football team that was closest to our hometown. This was in the early 1980s, and here's what that hat looked like. All right. I remember wearing this hat to school. I remember wearing it to play football in my neighborhood. I remember wearing it when I went to go visit my cousins who lived in the Washington, D.C. area. And honestly, I didn't think anything about the image on that hat. Not surprisingly, since I'm giving the talk today, I've changed since then. And I've learned a lot about the representation of American Indians from academic sources, from workshops I participated in that have been held by the National Museum of the American Indian, and I would say especially from members of the Nottawasepi Huron Band of the Potawatomi here in West Michigan. But I think there's a lot of room for change and improved understanding, certainly for me, and I think for our society more broadly. So my name is Garth Pauley, and I'm a professor of communication here at Calvin. And my interest in today's topic relates in part to a class I teach, Com 141 Visual Rhetoric. And in fact, in that class, we just finished on Monday talking about visual stereotypes of Native Americans. But my interest also connects to my research, which focuses on how marginalized and oppressed people resist dominant cultural discourses and practices. So my goal for today is to help, I hope, improve your understanding of a significant public controversy in the state of Michigan, namely the struggle over Native American mascots, symbols, and rituals. We won't talk too much about the rituals part probably, but Native American mascots and symbols in Michigan primary and secondary schools. The controversy seems to be most often centered on high schools. So that's my goal for today. I also hope that you'll want to learn even more at the end of this talk, and that you'll want to become a voice for understanding, compassion, and change. So from my point of view, if you better understand the context of relevant historical events, the current state of change and resistance, and the boundaries and opportunities for change in the future, I think our time together will have been well spent, and I hope that you'll think so too. So let's begin by running through a timeline of events in order to establish a context for the Native American mascot symbol and ritual controversy in Michigan. Obviously, this will be super selective. There are a lot of parts, so I'm just trying to choose the ones that seem most relevant, and we'll sort of jump around a little bit time-wise. First, I want to note, because I see folks who are students here, is that the impetus to do something about the stereotypical representation of American Indians in the sports context came from young people, right? As many sort of challenges to oppression can. I just finished teaching in another class talking about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the role that young people played in the American Civil Rights Movement. And once in this controversy too, it came from young people, namely from student activists within the National Congress of American Indians, who produced the video that I just showed. And this began in the late 1960s, right? So a lot happened from the 1960s and then through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, but I'll jump forward just to keep things focused. I would say that the campaign that was led by the National Congress of American Indians, especially by young people, really reached one of its high points in 1993 and started to gain more traction. And what happened then is that the Congress issued a powerful statement that year denouncing, quote, the use of any American Indian name or artifice associated with Indian mascots, end quote. And they also called upon, quote, all reasonable individuals to voluntarily resist change and dehumanizing mascots, to voluntarily change racist and dehumanizing mascots, right? Interestingly, so this is in 1993, if we're thinking about the more local context, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission actually issued a report 5 years before that statement by the National Congress of American Indians, back in 1988. And it stated, quote, any use of Indian names, logos, and mascots should be discontinued because racial stereotyping of Native Americans is prevalent and destructive, end quote, right? So that's all the way back in 1998. Obviously, there's been a lot of change, but there's still a lot of room, right? So it's interesting to think about that long history. Right, jumping back forward again, in 2001, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, right, the federal agency, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, issued a statement calling for, quote, an end to the use of Native American images and teen names by non-Native schools, end quote. And they also noted that, quote, the use of American Indian mascots is not a trivial matter, they emphasized. Okay. In 2003, turning back to Michigan, the Michigan State Board of Education adopted a resolution that recommended that schools stop using Native American mascots, images, and names, and it reaffirmed this position in 2010 and in 2017. In 2005, the American Psychological Association passed a resolution recommending that schools immediately retire American Indian mascots and symbols, and they noted, they note a lot of things, but I'll emphasize 3 of them. The first, the statement noted that the mascots and symbols undermine the educational experience of all students, not just Indigenous students, but all students. Second, they emphasized that these symbols and mascots establish an unwelcome and often hostile learning environment for Native American students in particular. And third, that they have a negative impact on the self-esteem of Native American children, for which they cite plenty of research. All right. Moving forward again, in 2016, the state of Michigan and the Nottawasepi Huron Band of the Potawatomi established what's called the Native American Heritage Fund. The money for it came from the tribal state gaming contract, excuse me. And the fund allocates $500,000 annually from the state's casino revenue sharing system for initiatives that, quote, form positive relationships between Michigan's tribes and local school districts. One of the major initiatives, maybe some of you know, is to help schools with Native American mascots and symbols transition to new ones. Right? And I would say that this has been one of the most influential turning points in the context of understanding this controversy in Michigan. In 2017, Michigan State Board of Education passed a motion to give the state superintendent the authority to withhold school aid from districts with offensive mascots, nicknames, and logos. However, almost immediately, the state's attorney general issued a formal opinion that the superintendent did not have the legal authority to do the thing that the superintendent said he was going to do. All right, and so things sort of stalled out there. Also in 2017, Michigan state senators introduced a bill to ban team names, mascots, and logos that are based on race or ethnicity. There was also a bill introduced to ban the Redskins team name in public schools. However, both were referred to Senate committees where they died. All right. In 2018, the first Native American Heritage Fund grants were issued, including one to a nearby school, the Belding Schools, that facilitated a name change from the Redskins to the Black Knights. Since then, many schools have changed their names, and I think it's worth noting that excuse me, it's almost always due to action by elected local school board officials, right? And that is true nationwide. It is almost never the case that a school superintendent will make the change, right? Or that it comes from some other place, but it's almost always due to action by elected local school board officials, all right? So now I would like to transition to the current state of affairs, a time of change and resistance, largely within the past 2 years, and we'll take a look at widespread change and also the resistance to the change. And so this part, I'll have some slides. If anybody is curious in having access to them later on, I'm happy to share them. Just stick around afterwards and let me know. All right, so I'll walk you through some things. First, what's worth noting, there's a lot of information here, but the last holdout school with the name of Redskins is the Camden Frontier Schools. And the Camden Frontier Schools, though, has decided in order to retire the Redskins name, imagery, and mascot at the end of this year. And so there will be no more Redskins names or imagery in Michigan schools after the end of this year. So this is an announcement that came from the superintendent of schools noting the change. The only reason I put it up here actually relates to the bottom, since it was decided, as I mentioned, by a locally elected school board officials. And this is like the most aggressive, passive-aggressive thing I've ever seen, is that there's a link there for the recall of local elected officials. So I think you can guess where the superintendent for the school stood on this issue on the basis of this, all right? But just a little bit of context there. All right. There are other schools that have recently retired the Redskins mascot, and one of them is the Sandusky School. And in fact, if you look closely at the T-shirt that this parent is wearing, you can see where the title that should have been, I think, hopefully was in quotes from my talk today, which is just a bizarre thing to have on a T-shirt. No, save our Redskins heritage is what the T-shirt says. And you can, if you know, for some odd reason you're so inclined, you can watch the video on YouTube of the concerned parents and talking about sending out notices to people in the local community, and they're filling envelopes, which you can see in the mail boxes behind, and would look for opportunities to sell their T-shirts to people in the local community. All right. Here's people at the, you can see the person on the left is the same guy, so going around. And the reason I put this here, I won't go over it a lot, but if you're curious about it, I mean, there are certain kinds of like rhetorical tropes in the struggle against them. And you'll see like some of them here, right? Don't let the superintendent or board retire our mascot. Again, there's sort of misunderstanding where power to do this lies sometimes, and it makes it seem like it's often coming from the outside and they're being unduly influenced. I mean, you see these tropes and other things as well. The money going to change the mascot could be going to help tribes in need. Again, so you just see some of the tropes of resistance here. Certainly there are others. But again, this campaign was unsuccessful, and Sandusky retired its mascot. All right. One particular controversy that's worth noting, because it illustrates a couple things, is one that was in Paw Paw. And it was ugly. It was really, really ugly. And when last year I had representatives from the Nottawasepi, Huron-Band, the Potawatomi come to my argumentation to class to talk about this, it was clear they were still very upset about it. And part of it read, or it seemed to me, was that they were just very upset about the way that tribal elders who went to the meeting to speak about it were treated. So really, I mean, this isn't much. It's just, I mean, the text editors keep me on track as much as anything. But in 2017, there was a 4-3 vote by the school board to retain the Redskin mascot and also to bar further debate on the mascot, right? The interesting strategy there. Quote, unless state funding for the school and its programs become at risk, right? And so that was decided at a meeting. So really just wanting to keep the mascot and shut down any further conversation, right? Except under this exception. It got so ugly at the meetings that local police were present at the meeting and people were ejected from the meetings as well. And there was more than just that. And in regard to the things at Pawpaw, in fact, the ACLU ended up filing a lawsuit with the Federal Department of Education and especially the Civil Rights Division. But they noted in summarizing what happened that advocacy by Native Americans in the area to change the mascot was beaten back with excessive hostility, aggression, and racial animus. So it was a really ugly episode. There were others similar, but I think this one seemed to be those things, only more so. All right. Just for a little bit more, so here's a billboard that was put together by the Michigan Coalition Against Racism on Sports that was put around the time that the school board was deciding these things, and so you can see that there, right? In response, you would then see things like this around Pawpaw, right? Okay. All right. As I mentioned, the ACLU, on behalf of local people, ended up filing a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and the department did end up taking up and launching an investigation. The investigation, I think, ended up not going anywhere because the school eventually changed the mascot. Although that wasn't all that the ACLU was complaining about. They were noting just a pattern of racial discrimination against Native American students in the school. And unfortunately, that seemed to go by the wayside a little bit because some of it was connected with the mascots and symbols, but not all of it was connected with those things. All right. So I'll move on to note some other mascots and symbols that have been changed. I think ones that sometimes don't get as much attention. Some of them maybe you didn't even know that schools with these names existed. So one of them, this is now gone, is the Marquette Redmen. So they changed. There were teams that were called the Big Reds. One of them was in Port Huron. You can see that they changed to the Red Hawks. I think that was in just this past year. And then in the Milan area schools, they are still called the Big Reds, but they made a change in the symbol of, it's interesting that their symbol is, I assume that's meant to be a red hawk, but still retain the name Big Reds, all right? So I think they saw it as sort of a compromise position, all right? But not everybody with the name Big Reds was interested in changing, and indeed the Chippewa Valley schools are one of them. And so they're still known as the Big Reds and still use Native American imagery for their symbols, as you can see here. Right? The most common, by my count, name and mascot and iconography connected with Native Americans is the Indians. There have been a number of schools that have changed, okay, for a variety of reasons. Two that did were Tecumseh and Hartford, and so they are no longer the Indians. But there are a bunch of schools that are still holding on to the name Indians and the imagery that's associated with it. I just have a couple of examples. One of them is the Chesaning Union Indians, right, and it uses imagery that I think most scholars and Native Americans would refer to as like the noble savage imagery, right? And Native Americans in particular would say so-called noble savage, still savage, right? And still a problem connected with that. And then you'll also see things like this with the White Cloud schools, similar kind of iconography there. There are other schools as well, and some of them are very strange, and some of them are like names that don't necessarily have to be like, well, I mean, this is tricky, but I mean, they're not necessarily like offensive per se, maybe because of their history. Not to say that there aren't still problems related with them, but then sometimes there are ways that are just clearly problematic. The clearest one would be like Red Raiders. So like if you look at a university team name like Texas Tech is called the Red Raiders, and there's a history behind that that's disconnected from Native Americans. Not to say that Native Americans wouldn't be entitled to be offended by it. It's not my place to say that. I mean, we could talk about that. But at least historically, it's not that, and the iconography is not related with it whatsoever. But then you have schools like this, the E-Course public schools, that are called the Red Raiders, and pretty clearly, right, there's Native American imagery going on here, getting back to the idea of, raiding parties by Native Americans, all right? The interesting thing about the E-Course one to me is that it's a dominantly like larger society, ethnic minority population that is the majority population at that school, right? It's African Americans. And yet here we are. Yeah, the NAACP has issued a supporting statement with the National Congress of American Indians soon after they issued that statement that I mentioned before. Okay, just maybe worth noting. All right. Other names that, again, don't necessarily have associations with Native Americans would be things like the Braves and the Chiefs, maybe, right? But that these two schools still have those names and those images. Another one that, again, clearly does not have to, and indeed many of the schools in Michigan are not associated with Native Americans with the term warriors, but then there are schools like Kindon North, Huron, that are the warriors, and this is how they're still known. And in a way, to me, that again, just maybe, I mean, surely they know about the controversy. I haven't looked into the details in Kindon North Huron, but it'd be hard to imagine that school officials aren't aware of controversies related to that. And then nonetheless, like this was their T-shirt for the athletic boosters for this year. And it just seems like a little bit, are they trying to stick their thumb in people's eye a bit, right? One school, one family, one tribe, right? Seems a little, it wasn't something that seemed part of the school language, I guess, before. It just stood out to me a little bit. I'm not saying it was motivated in that way. It could be out of, I don't know how you want to see it, ignorance or whatever, but nonetheless, right? That's what it is. All right. Okay. So given the current state of affairs that you see here, I think it's worth asking then, what's next, right? What's next? What are the boundaries and opportunities for change in the future? First, I would say that if people are committed to eliminating Native American mascots, names, and symbols from all Michigan schools, there are paths to doing so at the state level, right? And we can look to other states to see what they've done, if that's something that seems appropriate in the state of Michigan. We can look to other states that have pursued those paths. For example, in 2012, Oregon State Board of Education outlawed indigenous mascots in public schools, right? So that's something that some states have taken. In 2019, it took place at within state governing bodies. In Maine, in 2019, lawmakers passed a law that banned indigenous mascots in public schools and state colleges. In 2022, maybe some of you have heard about this. This seemed to get a lot of attention. The New York State Education Department took a different approach. They ordered school districts to change Native American-themed team names, logos, and imagery, or they would risk the removal of school board members or the loss of state financial aid. Again, it's hard to know to what extent these things could apply in Michigan. Way back when, as I mentioned before, the state attorney general in Michigan said, like, oh no, you don't, to this kind of approach. But it's hard to know, right, where that would wind up if the state wanted to take these approach. I'm not advocating for all of them or any of them in particular. I mean, I have opinions about them. I don't know if this is a place to share them, but it's just to indicate, right, like there are possibilities, right? There are possibilities other than the ones that are being pursued right now. That said, there are additional paths to take. Most notably, I think, and this is often left out of these discussions, is that the Michigan High School Athletic Association could take a stand, right? And they haven't really. So currently, the MHSAA encourages member athletic programs to, quote, have thoughtful conversations, end quote, and to, quote, consider all viewpoints, end quote, with regard to American Indian mascots, names, and symbols. They're very quick after that to emphasize, quote, "It cannot override school boards and has no power to ban any nicknames," end quote, and stops there. I don't know about to you, but to me, this feels like a bit of a cop-out. And especially if you put it in context. The MHSAA has a lot of power, and they are not shy about exercising it in other areas, right? Often in ways that make people upset, okay? So it's not like they're completely averse to using that power and in ways that will upset people. I think that this organization can do better. Certainly. If that's something that interests you, you could look on their website. It's mhsaa.com, and you could start a conversation with its executive secretary, Mark Isle, right? If that's something that matters to you. In addition to action at the government and athletic association level, I do think that people could do a better job at the local level as well. Schools and school district leaders can do a better job of learning more about the issues involved and connecting the problems related to mascots' names and images to their educational mission. It's bizarre how often that is emphasized, right? This is, if it's happening at the school level, how about if you talk about it, how it relates to the educational mission of the school, right? It doesn't seem like such a crazy idea, but often it is not discussed in that way and with that focus. I think, too, that people who advocate for change can do a better job. If they want to yield change, they could do a better job of building grassroots support. I think getting community buy-in and making change seem both possible and desirable. Finally, the people who run school board meetings where these issues are discussed and decided can do a better job of facilitating meaningful deliberation rather than providing forums for rationalizing rhetoric, invective, and further polarization, which is what seems to happen most of the time, right? And it's avoidable, right? It's not unavoidable to have people be emotionally involved, right? But it is avoidable to have it turning into that. So now that we've looked at the broader context related to Native American mascots, names, and symbols, the current state of change and resistance, and the boundaries and opportunities for change in the future, I hope that you feel more informed about this important public controversy. I also hope that you're eager to learn even more. I can suggest some books to you. I brought them along in my bag, right? And so I hope that you'll want to learn more, and that too, if it's something that matters to you and you feel convicted about this, that you can become a voice for understanding, compassion, and change. So I thank you for coming this afternoon, and after I take a drink of water, I'll be eager to answer your questions and discuss this subject more. So. Anyone? Again, I mean, there are a lot of assumptions, I think, from, that my perspective, some things that, I didn't want to include because to deliberate, but, now could be a time for talking about them, just curious. Yes.
I'm from Cleveland, originally, have a lot of family there. So they changed from the Cleveland Indians, their baseball team, to the Guardians. And I've talked to people, like I have a general, let's change kind of idea. But some are saying, I don't see why we have to change. No one, it's not hurting anybody. And so I was wondering what you say as your almost elevator pitch of what the reason is we change these things,
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can see why these conversations get heated, right?
Yeah.
Because if someone says it's not hurting anybody, right? If you're a person who feels hurt by it personally, right, because of your identity, how do you respond to that in a way, right? Because the comment itself feels just at face value, right, disrespectful, I think, to people, dismissive. Right, and dismissive. So, it's easier for me, right? I sort of white guy, right, no Native American heritage at all. I think, right? But I guess I would say to people, it does hurt people, right? And if you look at the statement by the American Psychological Association, the research shows how that hurt happens, right, to people who are Native American, but that the hurt doesn't stop there, right? It doesn't just stop, with students who see it in schools or people in the community who would see a sports team like that it spreads. And I think that's where there's a lot of room for education to show that it is hurtful, right? And if you educate yourself, that you can learn how that hurt happens. For some people, of course, that will not be sufficient, right? That even if they were to accept that would not be a sufficient reason. They could minimize that harm, right? They can minimize that harm and somehow think that there's something offsetting that harm. And those maybe are even more difficult conversations yet, right? But I think too with that one, although right, the Cleveland, now the Guardians, right, got rid of Chief Wahoo before they changed the name, right? So I mean, there are those sort of levels as well. But it could be good to be reminded for people of those things to say that yeah, there was some recognition, right, that there's something problematic going on here, right? Yeah. This was part of the problem, right? And it's great that part of the problem changed, okay? But there's this other part of the problem as well that is also worth changing, even if it seems lesser, right? Like lesser bad thing is still a bad thing, right? In the same way that then sometimes fans of one team might look to other teams, right? And like the Atlanta Braves, for example, right? And might feel like, well, why did our team, right, that I've been a fan of for a long time, nobody likes change, right? And nobody likes feeling like somebody from the outside is telling you change. Although sometimes you have to accept, maybe it's because they're from the outside, they allow you to get a perspective, right, that you wouldn't have if you're from the inside. But still, nobody likes it, right? And so it's easy then to look at others and say, but hey, wait a minute, right? What about this imagery? And what about the tomahawk chop and all that? But again, like in my argumentation class, I teach like that's not exculpatory, right? Yeah. I mean, that's as much an argument for them changing, right? I would say that's more so of an argument for them changing than for being able to retain.
So the APA has a statement.
They do, yeah. And there is research that, again, it would be nice if there were a little bit more research in that area, I think. A bit of it is dated. But it does show the psychological harm. A lot of it, I would say in many ways is similar for those of you who know the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? The research that was done there by the sociologist Kenneth Clark, right? It often talks about the dolls, right? And that were given the children, and that even African-American children preferred the white dolls, right? And preferred to play with the white dolls and had positive images associated with the white dolls, right? In ways that then reflected back on negative self-images because of these kind of broader stereotypes. It's a similar type of thing, the research results show.
I'm sure my mom will appreciate me getting her.
Yeah, and again, there's, Paul Chott-Smith is one of the co-curators of the National Museum of the American Indian, and I'd recently showed a video in the visual rhetoric class from him. He has a book that is only mildly provocatively titled, like, Everything You Know About American Indians is Wrong, right? But in the video and in the book, I mean, he really makes an effort to reach a broad audience and make some of the points that I made. I mean, it's where I think of, I mean, how my thinking is formed of saying, it's like, I get it, right? Like, people have certain kinds of traditions, and everybody is resistant to changing their traditions, right? And especially when those traditions become like a rallying point for your community and your family, right? And you have some sense of, I mean, a different kind of identity bound up with it, right? That kind of change, people don't like it, right? And again, and as I said too, he knows, right? He says from his point of view, he's like, I know that people don't like me coming in and suggesting to them that there is a problem going on here with regard to stereotyping. But that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be a reckoning with it. Yeah. Jane?
I found it interesting in the Pawpaw case that Native Americans themselves were saying, hey, this is offensive, but were met with racism on that. And then also that in that statement, it's like, we may consider future change if there's like a financial reason to it. So like almost like an invitation for a governmental regulation instead, but people don't like governmental regulations. Often in the times of justice, they talk about the church stepping in, right? So I'm wondering, in your things that you've been studying, is there a voice of the church in there somewhere that is?
No, don't ask that. Okay. collectively, I hope, when you ask that question, you're asking to be disappointed, I guess is what I would say a little bit.
I just wanted to hear
Yeah,
what
so it's mixed, I would say, from the little bit that I've looked into it. From my perspective, at least, on the plus side was, I can't remember the exact school district now, but it was the Episcopal Diocese in Northern Michigan did issue actually quite a strong statement and sent it to the local school district saying that, yeah, this name, here's why this name is problematic for reasons that surely you've encountered, but also from thinking about it, right, out of, from a Christian perspective related to things that you probably can fill in the blank, but also like even if you don't think that these things are happening, right? Could you at least listen to the people who are affected by it? And maybe you see it as a sort of act of, graciousness or sort of being charitable on your part, right? That, yeah, like, maybe there's sort of thinking like, we wish you would change for other reasons, but if nothing else, that, right? I mean, if nothing else, that. So there's that. On the other hand, I recall coming across an editorial. I can't remember if this was in Sanilac, but it was a pastor at an evangelical church who wrote a letter to the editor, and it was a sort of like, it titled like, is Redskin racist? And since I'm using it as a negative example, you can imagine what the answer from this person's point of view was. No, and it was then went on, which now, right, in this kind of context, it makes it difficult to have conversations without things like this happening. It was like, the people at the school have been corrupted by critical race theory, and it only went on from there, right? And just sort of saying, kind of attacking it, that critical race theory is, what's motivating it. But, and, it's Marxist and anti-Christian, and so therefore, this was the way to stick it to those Marxist, anti-Christian, etc., right, by keeping the name. So yeah.
You mentioned sort of a spectrum of offensive names in your talk, and I'm curious, does the research get at the full spectrum of that, or is it more looking at, the Redskins in particular, and is it also looking at iconography and practices, chants, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so it does. There's not a, who wants to be the person who puts together the calculus of offensiveness, right? I mean, nobody wants to be that person. But indirectly, surely there is. It's why there were some states that went after the Redskins name in particular, because they just figured there might be controversies related to these other things, but maybe there can be some consensus about the most offensive in most Native American folks' minds, and then maybe that sort of gets things going. But if nothing else, it gets rid of the worst case scenario. So there's certainly that. And different people would place things on the spectrum differently, I think. The iconography, I think, is the same way, right? I don't think, though, that depends on who you talk to. I don't know that you could say even people who would object to the, kind of noble savage imagery would necessarily see that as the worst, perhaps as many white folks would think, but rather will sometimes see the things that are representing artifacts that they would see as being sacred, right, would be worse. And so, like, it might be tempting, right, if you're not, sort of connected to that, to see like an imagery or rituals related to drums as like, well, surely isn't the noble savage image worse than that? But at least a number of Native Americans I know who would say, no, the drum business is worse, right? The depiction of it and the ritual of it, that's worse, right? Because it's religiously offensive. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I know your research is into the slots of people, but do you have a sense for sort of how much of the resistance would be because people don't want to admit that they're wrong or have participated in something that has hurt people and feel that shame?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, right? I mean, as Yeah, I mean, as a communication scholar, right, you can look at deliberations about it and arguments and position papers that people offer, and you can try to glean certain insights about it, but that is a very difficult one to discern, right, from how people communicate about things, right? I mean, how people communicate, I mean, right, trying to discern what's behind it is difficult at best, right? And I would say that one in particular, it's hard to know. To me, at least for the things that I've looked at, it doesn't feel that way to me, right? At least about the kind of continued resistance. The continued resistance, like if you look at news stories related to Paw Paw, for example, I mean, it will be like, you know, a person winds up on the evening news, and it will be, again, I think in a way that it is, at least to me, shocking, right? It will be like, how was it? There's one woman who said, like, they don't have, they don't have a right to say anything about this. Who does that, right? They don't. So, I mean, you will have some, I mean, sentiments like that. I think the place to look, Sam, would be thinking about like places that changed, right? Because some places did change kind of, I mean, voluntarily, I would say, and out of kind of educating themselves. And who knows, maybe bound up with that too, on the opposite side is a sense of, yeah, maybe sort of feelings of guilt about that. But as you know, right, the feeling of guilt could make you want to assuage it this way or assuage it this other way. Okay.
I was curious also because of like, when you said a lot of the changes are happening from school boards who would be like elected term, like officials with terms versus superintendents who are in sort of like career positions.
Yeah.
Like that around.
Yeah. Hard to know, I would say.
Your comment about the theying or the othering of people made me think about like community and how important it is in these conversations, and like who do we define as our community? And I think part of what the issues that we always struggle against is like, how do we become the most inclusive and most welcoming to all people? So is there an example where you can see where it's been like good, like they, you know, acknowledge the fact that there's this problem, and like they talk to the Indigenous community and it's been a fruitful conversation and then change has happened in a positive way?
Yeah, I wish I could remember the name of the school district. But at least to me, it seemed indicative of that, is that there was one particular school district, I forget which of the, but they had the, you know, the like the name, the mascot, and the symbolism. And they ended up changing. It was a while, I think it was before, is my recollection. Before and they didn't receive any of the funds, right, that would allow schools to change, okay? So they just decided that they were gonna change, right? They weren't feeling any like super pressure to do so, or that they were having any like financial incentive to do so. And what triggered it for them, at least by the school board's account, was that there had not been a tribal government in like geographically like nearby, right? But then one formed, right, like immediately adjacent to the school district, and that's what did it for them, right? It was, I think it was maybe a little bit of, yeah, we don't know anybody like that. There's not anybody in our community like that. But hey, now there is somebody in our community like that, right? And we could learn from those people, and maybe it makes the issue of offense not seem abstract, right? In the same way you could say, like, I don't mean to give offense, but offense it has to be oriented towards someone, right? And now the object of the offense is, right, yeah, there. So I don't know, I see that as positive, right? And the school board, I think it was that one too, said like, yeah, like we're gonna change, right? Like, yeah, we're gonna do it regardless of somebody trying to say yes or no or incentives or whatever, and that's why. So, any other questions? Yes.
I've actually had a recurring thought throughout your presentation. Have you, within your research, we all know that there are various racial slurs for different ethnicities, right? Have you seen anything that compares the racial slurs that we're seeing for the different ethnicities and using that as reasoning as to why this is not okay. Does that?
Yeah. So I mean, maybe indirectly, I don't know. I mean, if I'm understanding your question right, maybe some of you have seen before that there will be, there will be like a offensive visual symbol, right? That you can imagine being a sports team or mascot name, right? For an ethnic group, right? Other than Native Americans, right? And the accompanying word, right? It's one of those, like when I teach stuff like that in class, I'm like, oh crap, am I gonna get in trouble, right? Because you have to show it, right? In order to get the point, but it's uncomfortable for everybody. But I think the uncomfortableness is sort of the point, right? So yeah, it would be like, imagine, right? Like the worst, like Sambo imagery, right? And the N word next to it, and then that's gonna be called a sports team, right? And it goes through all different kinds of ethnic groups, right? And I think it's making that point, that there is this kind of weird hierarchy about it, right? So like, yeah. Like I was talking to my students about this on Monday and started to debrief with them afterwards, right? Like, think about the words that make you uncomfortable, like super uncomfortable with regard to certain ethnic groups, but you'll say Redskins at the drop of a hat, right? What does it tell you that you say that without feeling the same way? What does it say that a person in public probably wouldn't be subject to much rebuke for saying that word, right? Certainly you can have it be your school mascot name, right? And have the iconography of various things related to it, but not subject to the same type of, like stigma or whatever that are associated with other things. And so sometimes that is used, I think, to try to gain understanding. But it's tricky, no? Right? I mean, there's potential there, but it's not easy, I guess is what I would say. It's not easy to leverage the power. Other questions or thoughts? No.
I'm kind of interested in how this overlaps a little bit with the idea of like cultural appropriation in more benign senses, or at least in some people's minds it's benign. Because we were talking about here examples of, the use of names and icons which are offensive to the people of the group. But I think, there's other kinds of sometimes uses of parts of other cultures that are a little bit like harder to identify whether they're offensive or not, just because, I don't know, like Halloween, like how we have just gone through a holiday where we do see a lot of costumes out there which are coming from other cultures and being appropriated in that sense. Or Comic-Con, which is happening this weekend, when people debate a lot about like who's allowed to dress up as who, and is it offensive or not.
Right.
I'm just curious, like, if that's something that weighs in here.
It does, right? If nothing else, you'll get, I mean, I think this is consistent with what you're asking. It comes into play when people, live in a community with a school that has those names and images and mascots, and will say that it's honoring, right? Is that it's honoring. And again, I always think it's good to not talk about these things in the abstract, right? The honor, right? There has to be a reference point for it, right? And then also, honor is something that you induce in others, at least it seems to me, right? Like if the people you say that you're honoring don't feel honored, that tells you there's a problem there, right? In the same way that if you say like, well, this is not offensive, right? Suggests that like offense is an inherent thing, right? But if somebody feels offended by it, then there has been offense, right? But so I do think it comes into play with the honoring aspect, and people want it feeling like, is that, does it constitute a kind of appropriation? Certainly. I think but some people would even say it's not appropriation. It's like, it's mocking. Again, I'm not here to, right, you'll have to make up your own mind, and it can be a fine line, I would say. It's complex, right? And same thing with the rituals, right? Like especially the drums, right? Is that religious appropriation, which is certainly how some Native Americans would see it. Others might see it as just cultural appropriation, not necessarily religious appropriation. And others would see it as mocking, right? Okay, or sacrilegious, okay, to think about. So at least in the visual rhetoric class, the thing I like about that class is from a communications perspective, it's used to think about how does this function, right? Like not just what is the intention, right? How does it actually like work, right? What does that symbol, what does that name, what does it work to do exactly, right? Any other questions? I want to be mindful of people's time, but we have time, so. And I don't have any other place to go, so.
Yeah, just a book recommendation for people who want to pursue this a bit more. There's a really good, deep history that goes back all the way to the colonial period and revolution by a guy named Philip Deloria, whose father was a Native American activist in the 60s, Bind Deloria. Bind Deloria has the best titles ever. Custer died for your sins.
Yeah.
Anyway, his son Philip, now at Harvard, wrote a book called Playing Indian. And it goes back to the colonial era. And the first act, you might say, in that book, I was wondering if Professor Foley had it, is the Boston Tea Party, where the people boarding the British ship and dumping the tea dressed up as Indians.
Yeah.
It's a really, and it helps you to understand why this is so deep for many Americans who are not of Native descent, because it goes a long, long way back.
Yeah, and so if you're interested in like the immediate like mascot and name and that kind of controversy, so this is a book that, as I alluded to in my argumentation class last spring, and we're doing it this coming spring, that was one of the topics that all students had to write their papers about, right? They had to identify like a Michigan school that still had, mascot name symbols of some kind, and imagine their written argument. They're writing to the school board, right? And they're going to advocate, right, change or keep it the same and provide a rationale for it. Was a little bit surprising to me because I really tried to bend over backwards to make it clear to students. You can write whatever you want, right? As long as it's an argument that is well supported by research, careful reasoning. Every one of them were advocating for change, and a lot of them were directed towards the Camden frontier schools, and so they were happy to learn they're going to change, right? They're very excited, right? They're very excited about that. Anyway, so this is the book that I use for that class. It's a reader, so it's edited by C. Richard King, and it's called The Native American Mascot Controversy, a Handbook. And that many of the things that I identified on the timeline, that like are document statements and stuff like that, they're included in here, right? And in fact, in this one, that 1988 report by the Michigan Committee on Civil Rights, I think is the earliest document they have actually, right? So it's it's a good source. And it includes the research that you were asking about and that I mentioned. So there's tons of good stuff here, in addition to a variety of perspectives, and some of them historical, like the ones that Will mentioned. Another one, this is by two communication scholars, Andrew Billings and Jason Edward Black, and it's called Mascot Nation, right? So Mascot Nation, the controversy over Native American representation in sports. Most of the literature ends up being about pro and college sports, and this book is sort of heavy on that, I would say. But it does give good perspectives on the issues. And especially, like, if you were interested in advocating for this, like, this is just a gold mine because it identifies, like, the rhetorical strategies and tropes that are used by opponents to change, right? Like, here's what they say, and then here's how people try to respond to that. But it also includes research, like, after some schools that had really big controversies changed, like what happened afterwards, right? Like, which is very interesting. What happened afterwards? So they look at the University of Illinois controversy and the whole business with Chief Illini Wept, right? And they note that afterwards, one thing is like the people that they interviewed, everybody knew about the controversy, right? Even though when they interviewed people, it had been quite a while in the past. And a number of people, like with the passage of time, would say things that many people would not be willing to say during the heat of it, which is like, I would make interviewees, right? Like I was arguing at the time that like changing the tradition is bad because like my sense of, yeah, like, I mean, this is like important to me and it's important to who I am and I sort of identify with that tradition. And later on they would say, you know what, my fandom is not dependent upon the mascot, right? It's a pretty sophisticated statement, right? My fandom is not dependent on that and I realize that now, okay? So little nuggets like that, I would say, are in that as well. Please.
Just to tack on to that, the library has a lot of the books that are being mentioned. So if you're interested in reading more by Philip Deloria or C. Richard, you can find some of those things to check out here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have quite a different question.
And also, if people need to get up and go, you're not going to distract me, so by all means. Off of it, correct.
It is revolving sort of around the same subject. Pastor Rasul Berry was here earlier this week, and he spoke on racism and prejudice. And one of the things that he said really stuck out to me and has stuck with me. And it's the idea that racism is actually more of a spiritual struggle than it is just what we see it as. And so my question to you is, going back as far as the beginning, not the beginning as in the Bible, but going back to the beginning of America, when Christopher Columbus came over and quote unquote discovered America, we come to understand that Native Americans were already here. What's your stance on that? Because we still celebrate Columbus Day as if it's this huge, great thing, and reality is, to them, it's not. So what's your stance on that?
Yeah, it's a big, complicated issue, right? I mean, like the spiritual nature of it, I mean, it's hard to make connections. I mean, like the controversy today certainly can be traced back to certain strains of thought, right? I mean, habits of thought and habits of communicating, etc. Yeah, I mean, centuries ago, undoubtedly, right? But you know, but tracing it is difficult, right? Or sort of assuming, right, something that happened then, a certain type of discursive practice or way of thinking that happens then, right, sort of naturally finds its way into the present. I don't know if this makes sense, right? Like I guess I would be resistant to that a little bit. But at the same time, right, thinking in terms of a perspective that has religious resonance, the white settlers and what white settlers did, right, in our nation was based on a certain way of thinking, of course, about indigenous peoples, right, that inherently devalues them, right, and it sees them as being lesser human, subhuman, all of that, and I would agree, right? So therefore, in the large sense, it's a spiritual struggle, right? It's a spiritual struggle against an implicit theology that categorizes people in a certain way. Right? So I would certainly see it that way. You know, how much can we say like things like these controversies that I'm talking about, right? I mean, is there still a strong connection with that idea? I don't know, I mean, it's hard to say, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it's like under the surface a little bit, right? To greater and lesser extents, I guess is how I would put it.
You go ahead. What's your pin?
Oh, the pin. This is missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? And so it's a campaign worth learning about. And I'm also very careful to where I bought this from, that I bought it from Native American artists, so it didn't feel like other people were profiting from what was happening. But if you don't know about it, if you just go to IWG.org, you can learn a lot about it. And it's the Nottawasapi Huron Band of the Potawatomi there are a number of people of that band who are very actively involved in it. And it's all kinds of troubling, right? Because it just relates to all different kinds of things, right? racism, sexism, and issues related to how law enforcement works in communities that are, tribal communities that are supposed to be sovereign, right? But do not have complete sovereignty when it comes to law enforcement. And I would say that's a big part of the problem, and a lot of people don't understand that. It's worth becoming educated about.
So I think this question might have to do and could be considered decolonization efforts. But I've been to a number of different universities or conferences done by like public organizations that before they start something will preface like we are standing on the grounds of this tribe or something in regards to that. And maybe you did that at the beginning of your presentation, you came in late. But I wonder if that's something that Calvin sees in the future for them, if that's something that we would incorporate, or if you see the benefits of talking about that and prefacing that.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people at Calvin that maybe some of you encountered will have that, like they'll preface sometimes comments with it, or events, or have it like in the, what's the email?
Signature.
Yeah, signature sort of line, I guess. You know, from my perspective, I sort of feel like, who am I to tell anybody with regard to something like that? I think I just always, for me at least, I worry that it, depending on how one does it, it ends up being almost like trivializing things in some ways, right? It's not really like, I mean, like maybe it can, right? If it ends up functioning as an invitation to conversation, then so much the better, right? But if it just becomes like sort of signaling, right, like your egalitarianism, then is it really any better than, I'm not racist, some of my best, don't finish that sentence, right? Okay, don't finish that sentence, right? Does it end up kind of functioning in that way? I guess is kind of what I worry about. All right, well, it seems like we've come to the end of our time, so I suppose we should disperse. But it's a pleasure to see you all, and thanks so much for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.